And on behalf of England, can I just apologise to everybody here for that? But moving on. So as you can see by the slide that's behind me, I'm going to talk about birds. I'm not really, okay? I'm going to talk about homelessness and the SDGs. But I just want to get a feel about who would understand it if I talked about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Put your hand up if you understand what I'm talking about there. There's a few that don't. So Sustainable Development Goals agreed at the United Nations, running up to 2030, very high level goals. And within them, around about, I think, 269 indicators that indicate progress that we're making towards achieving these goals. Very high level, very laudable, and I'm a great supporter of them. So back to birds. Who here is a bird watcher? Put your hand up if you're a bird watcher. Oh, you've got two. This is a guilty secret. This is like me supporting Middlesbrough Football Club, but we actually have got two people who are bird watchers. So you'll know that every year between December and the end of February, there's something called the Irish Garden Bird Survey. And people go out into their back gardens and they count birds and their species. And from this, they can tell about the health of the bird population in Ireland. What you might not know is this happens all over the world during the same period, overlapping. So the Royal Society for Protection of Birds in England, that goes out and it counts birds. The Audubon Society in America goes out and it counts birds. And all of this information is collated and brought together. And from that data, we can tell if some species are at risk. And has this been a man-made factor? Has it been pesticides that we've put out there? Has it been environmental disaster that's caused it? But whatever the case is, we can work backwards from that kind of premise, and we can say, what could we do to make sure that these species survive? We know how many numbers there are in the world. What can we do to help here? Why am I telling you this? Because we know much more about how many birds there are in the world and their health than we do about how many homeless people there are in the world and their health, which is extraordinary if you think about it for a second. So 1.4 billion homeless people across the planet, we estimate, and some of these we can fairly confidently talk about with some numbers. For example, we know that there are around about 880 million people living in slums across the world. And we know that because satellites coalesce over big slums in Manila and in Brazil, and they count the rooftops and the size of them, and they can tell how these slums are growing, and through very complicated algorithms, they can make assessments about how many slum dwellers that we have in the world. We know, for example, that the highest number ever in recorded history of refugees, IDPs, internally displaced people in the world at the moment, running at about 70 million people. And we know that they're there because they'll cross border and be registered, or they'll be in camps, or they'll be seeking help. So we've got a fairly accurate figure on that. But when it comes to street homeless people, we really have not got a clue. The UN made a guess in 2003 about it, and it said, we think there's about 100 million. We think there's about 100 million. And the reason that they're guessing is that very few countries, probably 26 to 30 countries in the world, actually count homelessness. And those that do count it have different definitions about what they mean by homelessness. So that's the first point I want to make, is that we just don't know how many people are out there. But I'm guessing from my own travels around the world, 100 million, even 150 million is an underestimate of this problem, which affects every single city in the world. So isn't it ironic, given the fact that this is in every city in the world, that when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 goals, that street homelessness doesn't feature at all, not as one indicator in any of the 17 goals at all. Homelessness is not present at all. And why? Why? Because there is no agreed definition. And if there is no agreed definition about what we mean by global homelessness, how can you measure it? How can apples be apples and pears be pears? And if you can't measure it from this point of view of the UN, it doesn't exist. There is no baseline to this. How do you know, if you put a target in place, whether things are getting better or things are getting worse? Because actually you can't measure it. So how could we create a goal? And yet, let's just take an example of 3 or 4 of those goals. I'm assured that this will work, so let's have a go. It did. Let's have a look at these goals. I'm going to pick out 4. So goal 1, SDG 1, eradicating poverty in all of its forms. Well, look, poverty is a relative concept, but I think we'd all agree, wouldn't we, that a sure sign of poverty is people living on the streets of our city. Should there not be an indicator about that? If we looked at SDG 3, ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all at all ages, well, we know that housing is a social determinant of health. And there's overwhelming evidence that if you're on the street, both your physical health and your mental health is going to suffer. And in fact, the average life expectancy in the UK of somebody living on the streets is 43, as opposed to 70s. So nearly half a lifespan from living on the streets. Reducing inequalities, SDG 10. Homeless people are one of the most discriminated groups that you'll find of any groups in the world. I could take you to our projects in America, which are largely, almost 95% black when you walk into them. People who've been in gangs, who've been ghettoized, who've been discriminated against. But that's true as well of gender in certain parts of the world, of sexuality, and certainly it's true of income. In all of my 33, 35 years of working with homeless people, I've met very few rich homeless people. Very few rich homeless people. And then SDG 11, probably the one that's most pertinent, making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And this includes providing safe and adequate housing for all. So you would think, wouldn't you, that absolutely that must mean that an indicator of that would be street homelessness. And yet, no, because we don't have this definitional language, we don't have this measurement. So, when you come to my seminar, we're going to talk a little bit about this, about what we can do. What can we talk about in relation to this idea of definition and some of the work we've done around that at the UN? We're going to talk a little bit about how we can measure homelessness around the world. We're going to talk a little bit about what are the causes, what are the feeders into street homelessness around the world, and we're going to talk a little bit about who's made a difference, who's actually done some things that have made a real difference to that. And I'm lucky to have David Carroll here, who's the CEO of Depaul Ireland. He's going to try and shape a little bit of that into an Irish context. And we've also got Dame Louise Casey here. For those of you who don't know Dame Louise, she was Tony Blair's street czarina back in 1999 through. And Louise was responsible for a reduction in street homelessness of 2/3 between 1999 and 2002 in the UK. So it's somebody who's actually done it, delivered a reduction target to there. And we've also got Josh Littlejohn from the world's biggest sleep out, which is going to be held in the Quad outside on the 7th of December. And he's got an interesting take as well on this issue of homelessness, and I'm sure he'll be trying to sign you up for the sleep out as well. I'm sure that will happen. So listen, all welcome. Thanks to Jules, thanks to the organisers for today. I hope you all enjoy it, and please come up and ask me any questions that you have as the day goes on.